So it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers, and Martina and Tracy are joining us from not too far away in Minnesota. And they both work for one of our local native plant nurseries, Natural Shore Technologies. And we've had a lot of members, including one of our board members, ask for a presentation on restoring your shoreline. And so our board all thought of Natural Shore and the staff there, because the nursery specializes in growing plants, both emergent and shoreline plants, and they've done a ton of restoration work both in residential, commercial, and larger landscapes. So Tracy and Martina are joining us with a ton of experience working for Natural Shore Technologies. And Tracy is an ecologist, and she's got over 6 years of experience working at Natural Shore, doing invasive plant management and all the fun restoration actions that come after planting a native planting. And she earned a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Science from the U. And Martina Piper is also joining us. They will be co-presenting, and Martina has a background in nursery management, but now sounds like she's rolling up her sleeves and working also in the field on invasive species and native plant landscapes. So we're thrilled to have both Martina and Tracy here this evening to tell us more about how to restore our shoreline. And I'll let them take it from there. And thank you so much, Tracy and Martina, for being willing to present. And we have a very eager audience. And again, just as a reminder, please make sure you are muted. And if you have any questions for our presenters, we'll moderate those questions when Tracy and Martina are finished their presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Heather. I wish all of our elections went that smoothly and fast. And yeah, thanks for having us tonight on this really nice rainy night. We're really glad to see this rain. Our presentation tonight, like you said, will be about installing and maintaining restorations on shorelines with native plants. And admittedly, a lot of these shorelines this year were a little bit low. The water levels were pretty low with the drought. We've had a couple years of severe drought. And these shorelines in this presentation aren't just lake shorelines, or stormwater retention ponds, rivers, creeks, a bunch of different shorelines all over Minnesota. So they could really use the rain. We're really happy to see it. And Martina also is on the maintenance crew. I'm just trying to advance my slide here. Oh, no. Doesn't look like it's, oh, there we go. I'll just go into a little bit about what Natural Shore does. We're a local ecological restoration company. Me and Martina are on the maintenance side of things. We grow all of our own plants, like you mentioned, pesticide-free in our greenhouse. Many different species of plants that we use in shorelines, wetlands, prairies, rain gardens, many different kinds of projects every year. And we design those projects, grow the plants, install them, and then a really important part of these native plant projects is maintenance. And we usually include 2 years of maintenance at least in all of our installation projects. So yeah, that's just a little bit about Natural Shore. Getting into a lot of common shoreline issues that clients come to us about. They might have been on a lake shore or a stormwater retention pond. And a lot of times they come to us with a lot of eroded shorelines. They're losing their shorelines as it erodes into the water. There's a lot of degraded habitat. They might be looking, after reading one of Heather's books, to encourage a lot more pollinators and wildlife to their backyards. And the habitat that they currently have just currently isn't doing it. We run into a lot of clients that have many different species of invasive plants. There's a lot of stormwater retention ponds and lakes that have nutrient runoff and pollution problems. A lot of these shorelines are on really steep banks, and a lot of things run off those banks into the water, causing a lot of pollution. So they're looking to help remedy that. And in many cases, they're just looking for some improvements in aesthetics. So those are a lot of common issues we get from our clients, and I'll just go into a little bit more of those. Here's an example of an eroded shoreline. You can see the bank is just falling away. A lot of this happens from wave action. A lot of people are using their boats on the lake. We really love our lakes a lot. Recreation is really huge in Minnesota, and a lot of wave action can come and erode shorelines. There's also a lot of ice heave in the winter, depending on where you are on the lake. So that's a big problem too. Degraded habitat, you can see here, this is just a monoculture of turf grass, really. Things aren't really attracting much butterflies, bees, anything like that here. There's also a little bit of an incline going into the shoreline, so a lot of stuff is running down that slope into the water. Just not a lot to look at, not a lot that's attracting things other than these geese we have here. So we want to look for some variety. A lot of times people will put riprap on their shoreline, these big rocks or boulders here, and that might help stabilize the shoreline somewhat, but it really doesn't do anything for habitat. You're not going to get a lot of bees and butterflies here in these rocks. You might get a couple frogs, but really it's not helping anything for water quality. It's not helping habitat. So you might have fixed the erosion problem, but it's really not doing anything for those other issues. And then invasive species, we'll go into just a couple of those later on. Kind of the most common ones we run into. In this picture, we're seeing a lot of reed canary grass, a very common weed. It might stabilize the shoreline. It might create a little bit of a buffer there to help filter pollutants, but it's really not helping anything for habitat. It will keep moving into other areas and pushing out native species. There's other invasive species that will keep creeping into your lawn or degrading other areas. So it's important to keep a lookout for these invasive species as well. Another issue here is it's just a monoculture, and it's not really very interesting to look at. Going back to, that nutrient runoff and pollution, this is a golf course, and you can see some of that algal blooms, especially later on in the season after it's been really hot. Those start to form. It's not very nice to look at. It's really clogging up this pond, and it's a big issue that we see here in Minnesota too, where we want to use our lakes and big ponds for recreation, and this just isn't very inviting for that kind of thing. Going back into invasive species, here's a really common one we find quite often. It's purple loosestrife. It's a kind of attractive flower. It's kind of nice to look at. It's a very pretty pink and purple flower that was originally used as an ornamental plant in gardens, and it escaped. The problem with some of these escapees is that they have a lot of different seeds that stay viable in the soil for a long time. They don't have very many natural predators, and it's taken over. It's invaded a lot of our natural areas, our natural wetlands, and it's causing a big issue where it forms these really dense monocultures where it's really pushing out a lot of very interesting native plants, and it might provide a little bit of habitat for some bees for food, but as a monoculture, it's really not helping other species, and it's pushing out a lot of those native plants. So we're not really getting any diversity here. Reed canary grass is another one I talked about. And it might help with erosion, like I said, but really not a lot of habitat value, not very interesting to look at. We run into this one a lot, and once we remove it and plant a diversity of native plants, it really does make a dramatic difference very quickly, to bring in a lot more flowers and different textures of sedges and grasses, and you just definitely don't need a monoculture on your shoreline. We'll just keep kind of drilling that point home. Diversity is very important. A lot of people who come to us are surprised to hear that cattails are not native. At least this narrow-leaved cattail is not native. We do have a native broad-leaved cattail here in Minnesota, which really doesn't form quite as dense thickets of they're actually very pretty, the native cattail, I think. But this narrow-leaved cattail, you might have noticed in wetlands that have filled in, or stormwater ponds filled in with these cattails. And they produce a lot of seed that stays viable for a very long time. It's wind dispersed, so it spreads very easily. And this one can be a little bit tougher to control just because it's regulated by the DNR. So it does provide some shoreline stabilization with its root structures, but isn't going to do much for habitat. And so this is one that we also really recommend to remove, and is a very common one that we run into. And like I mentioned, there's just a ton of different benefits of native plants. I'm sure you guys have heard of a lot of these as well in previous presentations. We really could do a whole presentation on these benefits. I really want to stress the drought tolerance that a lot of these native plants have, because we've been into a drought these last couple years. A lot of them that we'll talk about tonight can really handle that temporary inundation of water too if it floods. I think aesthetically they're very beautiful compared to a lot of ornamentals and cultivars, and just an added benefit is that they provide so much habitat for pollinators. I think it's really great to have these in your yard and kind of be able to talk to your community members about the different native plants that we have in Minnesota, just to kind of educate people. I know WildOnes is really great at education, and we try to be too at Natural Shore, really try to kind of counter out that plant blindness that a lot of people talk about, where we don't really recognize plants in our daily lives, or really appreciate the impact nature has on our well-being. So it's nice to have even a couple of these in your yard that you can talk to people about and really go over some of these benefits with them. So in the shoreline restorations that we do, there really is more than just that one area by the water that we're restoring. We try to, especially for making a buffer area, we try to make a good amount of that restoration go towards the upland side of things. Water can really like the hydrology of a lot of these sites changes depending on the year. And it's nice to put plants in all of these three zones: the upland area where things are a little bit more dry. And then we've got that transitional zone where those plants kind of like their feet wet, or their root system's a little bit wet. They can handle periods of drought and inundation. And then one thing that we really encourage people not to forget about is the emergent zone, where those plants, those root systems are in soils that are completely saturated with water. And then their leaf parts or upper parts kind of stick out of the water. And those are really important parts of shoreline restorations to counteract wave action, ice heave, and a lot of the erosion issues. So here are a few of those upland plants A lot of them are drought tolerant, like I mentioned. They are many different colors, different flower shapes, flower sizes, bloom times. There's much more variety than just this. This is just a small sampling of some of the native plants available out there. And yeah, just keep in mind different colors, different flower shapes, and bloom times. Here are different of those more transitional zone flowers. A lot of people really love cardinal flower. That one really attracts hummingbirds along with blue lobelia. Marsh marigold that blooms in the spring is a really great one to see when you're just sick of winter and you finally find one that's blooming and you know spring's here. It's really important for early pollinators. We really love to see little bees on that one. Different blazing star species. New England aster, that one bloomed here in the fall. That's a great one to have in a restoration. Many different, again, heights of flowers and colors. Diversity is very important. Here's more of those emergent species I was talking about. Very interesting looking shapes. A lot of them are really great for migratory ducks. This burreed, you see here, a lot of ducks eat that. A lot of ducks eat arrowhead seed. So really important to have these emergent species as well. Prickleweed is a really beautiful emergent flower. So yeah, they're very interesting different species. And now Martina will take over here and talk a little bit about different things to consider when you're planning your restoration. Oh, maybe can you unmute? I don't know if you can unmute yourself.
Okay. All right, there we go. So yes, hi everybody. My name is Martina, and it's great to be here with all of you tonight virtually. So we're gonna discuss some things to consider before starting a shoreline project. After hearing all the benefits and seeing all those beautiful native plant pictures, you might just want to jump right into the deep water, but I suggest we take a step back and start with getting your feet wet, literally and figuratively. So literally by that, I mean considering and identification of the species present on your shoreline already. For example, this lovely pink flower in the top corner is called Agellinus, or false foxglove. We see this one a lot occurring naturally on the shorelines that we manage. But although you may have some naturally occurring natives, you also have to consider the invasives that may be present, such as this very noxious Canada thistle that is a very common one we run into, as well as the ones Tracy mentioned, such as the reed canary and the purple loosestrife. So considering that, if you have these invasive plants present, we highly recommend starting from scratch, just trying to get rid of the vegetation there. Eradication is the goal for these weeds, but it is nearly impossible with all the surrounding seed sources, as well as the seed bank. Those seeds have just fallen over the years and they will be persistent. So another thing to consider before starting is your soil and exposure conditions. I'm sure this has been drilled into everybody's head, but right plant for the right place. It is our mantra. So you want to take a look at what soil textures you have. Is it clayey, silty, sandy? This will definitely influence the plants that will like to grow there, as well as sun exposure. And you can definitely have different microclimates on your site. For example, there may be a couple trees or shrubs, not necessarily on the shoreline, but in the way of how the sun moves through the sky. And that will need to be a factor into consideration. And yeah, just thinking about also our seasonal conditions, these past 2 years again have been very droughty. So we want to make sure that we plant the very tolerant species, native plants. They can tolerate those differing conditions. Another thing to consider is definitely plant heights. Especially if you would like a very good view of your shoreline or lake, you want to make sure you're not putting anything too crazy in there, such as cup plant. That one can get about 6 to 7 feet tall. But something else to keep in mind with this is that soil moistures and the physical characteristics of the soil will definitely influence the height of the plants. For example, Joe Pye weed, which is in the bottom left-hand corner, it's kind of that umbel-like pink flower head. That one can get quite tall, but if you put it in a more medium to dry soil moisture, it can stay a little shorter. We usually recommend, starting shorter in the front and then getting progressively taller in the back. But you can also add some little pops of color like these spikes in the front, cardinal flower and prairie blazing star. Those are definitely stars of the show, and we like to put those more towards the front, even though they can get a little taller. So the goal here is to have varied plant heights and textures. Yeah. And then we're gonna look at some more specific objectives. For example, a lot of these are clients come to us specifically asking for help with. So first we have erosion control, and the best method for this is using more aggressive rhizomatous plants. A lot of grasses and sedges work great for this, as well as those emergents that Tracy was featuring. They are very hardy and long-living species, and there's just a lot of beauty in their function of holding that shoreline together, as well as providing habitat for the critters that like to hang around the shoreline. Some of these no, that's all right. Some of these species include, for example, shrubs. Winterberry is like wet roots, as well as red twig dogwood. And then also, as far as the sedges go, lake sedge, tussock sedge, as well as the Chenoplectus genus, which is the bulrushes, as well as burreed, which Tracy was talking about. Another thing that sometimes our clients desire is lower maintenance or less messy look to their restorations, depending on people's tastes and objectives. So for this, we definitely recommend plants that are more longer lived, so you won't have to keep replanting them over and over, in species that don't self-seed as much as others may, as well as having that herbivore resistance. And sedges work, again, very great for this. We have in stock Beb sedge and fox sedge, very beautiful clumping sedges that produce these lovely brown seed heads in the summer, and they just have a really aesthetic look to them. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, for wildlife, we want things to be very messy. And I'm thinking that this is most of you, as well as we prefer to provide for the wildlife. So you want to provide a lot of that general things that you usually just see in nature. It's a natural shoreline. So the seed heads that are standing right now are actually going to be feeding those migratory birds, as you can see on the purple coneflower. And yeah, it's just great to have all of that mixture in there. It's very dynamic and sorry. So yeah, just a lot more messy for wildlife and a lot of layers in there. And you may think that exposed soil is bad, that you need to cover every square inch, but actually bare soil is very beneficial for ground nesting bees that use that bare soil to excavate nests and raise their offspring. So here is just a little snippet of the native bees and butterflies that we see in our restorations. They all have their own specific host plants and their preferred nectarine plants, pollen plants. And since this organization is called WildOnes, we say keep it wild to attract wildlife. And then this is a beautiful array of the different bloom times of the species that we currently carry in our greenhouse. Not all of them, obviously, but just a snippet, again, emphasizing that you want different colors, textures, as well as blooms throughout the season, not only for aesthetic interest, but also for those native pollinators. Diversity is the key. And then here's some other creature features that you may find in your restoration. We find so much joy in seeing what is using our native restorations, and we think you would really enjoy it too. Another thing to consider that may not be the most fun thing, but it is a huge factor, is your budget. So obviously, starting from scratch would be a little more upfront cost, but that also you have to consider the time and effort that you will be putting into maintenance of the weedy species. And seed, again, is cheaper than potted plants, but again, maintenance will be very important. Those native seeds can take a little more longer. I mean, depending on what kind of seed you have in your mix, it may take 2 to 5 growing seasons to really get established. And also you can lower your designated area size or even do phases. We have a lot of clients who have a little bit of budget constraints, so we can do different phases. For example, one year we may do, instead of doing 300 feet of shoreline at once, we might do 100 feet for 3 years. Then you also want to consider any additional materials you may need, such as temporary fencing to keep the geese out. And then also look into grants from your city and watershed districts. A lot of our clients do use these resources, and it's great to hear that the community is supporting it. Overall, making an investment in the well-being of our valued bodies of water and life that inhabits them will pay a lot in its beauty and ecosystem health. And last but certainly not least, you want to consider your expectations. So like I discussed, plant establishment can be a little slow, especially if you thought you had the right place for a plant, but it ends up not being the best. And of course, this translates into learning experiences. We have a lot of these every season, and we like to discuss what we've learned. And it's just a great time to always be learning with these restorations. And again, you'll need to put time investment in these. It's not a no maintenance thing. Everything needs maintenance, as Tracy will be talking about. And also seasonal changes and just the evolution of your restoration. Seeds get tossed here and there, either by the wind or by birds and not insects, but yeah, it just will change over time and kind of find its place. And so
Great,
it will
so-
go back to Tracy now.
Thanks, Martina.
Yeah.
I'll just go into a few more specifics about how we install and maintain our restorations. You can see in these pictures, we're using a lot of erosion control materials. We have biologs that we install on our shorelines just to kind of immediately stop that erosion and give the plants a little bit of time to establish. Those plants will eventually grow those deep root systems and hold that shoreline together. But until they grow for a few growing seasons, those biologs really help. We also might do a woody removal where we're removing buckthorn and then kind of form those into brush bundles and put those along the toe of that eroded bank as well to help hold the shoreline together. So the first step is to really make sure we stop that erosion and give the plants a little bit of time to establish. We'll be going into a few project examples here in a little bit, and a lot of them are seeded projects or seeded projects with the 3 or 4 inch potted plants mixed in, planted into that fabric or mulch to kind of give the restoration a few nursery plants, things that can jump up kind of quickly and get that restoration going. Martina mentioned temporary fencing as well to keep a lot of geese or muskrats out until the plants have established. And then going into maintenance, the first step we do is really identify site-specific conditions. Maybe there's a large population of little bunnies running around, so repellents are used for that. There might be a neighbor that has a bunch of buckthorn with berries on it, and so we might want to consider that in our plant list too, that there's nearby seed sources of things. There's always going to be site-specific challenges. I highly recommend everyone to keep journals of their maintenance practices on their sites. We keep very detailed notes for every visit that we do and identifying different challenges for those specific sites. And it's like Martina said, it's a lot of learning, it's a lot of problem solving, just to kind of help those plants establish. We also do a lot of prioritizing in our timing of maintenance and use what's called IPM, or integrated pest management. And basically that means just really having a lot of different tools in your toolbox. We don't come to each site with the same cookie cutter plan. We try to, identify those conditions and then come and try different different tools. We might do a lot of hand pulling, weed whipping at certain sites. Other ones might require more herbicide treatments or mowings. There's prescribed fire you could use for IPM, as well as in this picture here, there's some purple loosestrife weevils. So biological control is also a really up and coming and helpful tool in the toolbox. And like Martina said, there is some time investment in especially early restorations, and going back to prioritizing, we recommend that people really go after the invasive species that are flowering at that time. A big concern is to keep it from going to seed. So prioritize, come in with a plan, keep track of what you do, and the lessons you've learned on your site. And just again, maintaining diversity. A lot of times in early lives of restorations, certain species will come in and kind of dominate the other species. So sometimes we are removing bergamot so that other species can kind of fill in. Otherwise, there might be a species that takes over, like bergamot or goldenrod, other things like that. So we come in and specifically thin out some plants, even though they're native, to make sure diversity is maintained. Sometimes we might see certain plants getting too tall for the objectives of the client, like they want to see their lakeshore, so we'll cut things down a little bit. A lot of times you can cut things down a little bit in June and July, and they'll still bloom when they're supposed to. Like Martina mentioned Joe Pyeweed. That's when we might cut down a little bit in June and it'll still bloom, just maybe a little bit shorter. And there's a lot of people that maybe have gotten the impression that native plants don't need maintenance. They might have even been told by someone that native plants don't need any maintenance. We would say it definitely is lower maintenance than watering or mowing your lawn once a week, but it's definitely not no maintenance. And especially again in young restorations, the first couple of years are very critical. In that time, learn as much as you can about your specific site, and then you can adjust things as you learn. Maybe Carniflower doesn't really like the soils of your site, and you can either mend the soil a little bit or try a different species that attracts hummingbirds like blue lobelia. So just keep troubleshooting, keep problem solving. We tell a lot of people that nothing happens overnight. So one of our #1 tools for new projects is kind of to have a little bit of patience, not come in too heavy-handed all at once. Just trust the process, trust the native plants. Even if you do have rabbits that come in and chew everything down overnight, we really like to trust that the native plants have those strong root systems, and a lot of times they'll come back up and then have even more blooms from where they were chewed down. So definitely have patience and definitely trust that those native plants are going to look very beautiful. Just give it a little bit of time. And like Martina's mentioned a few times too, that there's going to be weeds in your neighbor's yard. There might be birds that bring things in. So there is maintenance every year. There's battling weeds every year. We highly recommend people keep in mind new weeds that are coming into Minnesota from out of state. These are called early detection weeds. You can visit the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, and they have a lot of good information on early detection weeds and different weeds that are on like the noxious weed list and things like that. Try to identify as many different species that you find in your restoration, because especially in shorelines, things are going to find their way in from runoff. A lot of these shorelines are attached to water bodies that aren't in a closed system. So things are coming in from the wind, they're blowing in from stormwater or running in from stormwater. So you're going to find things that you didn't recognize before, and you can definitely call us and we can help you identify different species, or we use a lot of different resources we'll mention a little bit later on to help you identify some new invaders. And then just to kind of counteract what we're talking about, where the first couple of years might be very heavy on maintenance, but a lot of our clients we've had for 10+ years at Natural Shore, and eventually, you know, things kind of work their way into their specific niche, and kind of find an equilibrium where they behave kind of well with each other. And it's definitely less maintenance as time goes on after those first couple of years. We are talking long periods of time where you know, remnant prairies have been around for hundreds, thousands of years and have found their equilibrium where disturbance doesn't really affect them as much. But in these urban areas, these restorations are quite young in that time frame, and maybe a tree might fall down in a storm, or you know, a restoration floods, and then things need to kind of find a new equilibrium. But just remember those first couple years are very heavy on maintenance. And now we'll just go into a couple different shoreline examples that we've done in the last couple years.
Yeah, so here we have a private shoreline in Edina. As you can see, it is completely turf to the lakeshore with some erosion issues going on. And that grass you see growing is, of course, reed canary grass. So our method for restoring this shoreline included killing off that turf with some herbicide and the invasive plants, as well as putting in 3 and 4 inch potted plants. So here you can see the results of using the herbicide on the turf. So we gutted that out and then put some mulch down and planted the plants. As you can see in year 1, they're pretty sparse. There's a lot more mulch than what we'd like to see, a lot more bare ground. But in year 2, things really take off. You can see all the beautiful blooms happening, and that shoreline seems very protected. And I'm not sure if you can see, but this is after 5+ years. So this was just from this season, these pictures. And for maintenance techniques for this particular site, we used a lot of hand pulling due to the small size of the sites, as well as thinning out those more aggressive native plants to make room for other desirable ones, as well as some supplemental planting in some bare spots. An issue that we had with this restoration in particular was the muskrats absolutely loved to be on the shoreline, and they liked to chew on those bulrushes. But as you can see, the native plants came back very well and established and are preventing runoff and erosion from happening. Here's another example. This one is more of a hillside, and this particular site had a lot of invasive species present, nothing super desirable on in the hillside. And our method for this particular site was doing a seeding and laying down some erosion blankets and biologs. So as you can see on the left-hand picture, there's what the biologs look like, as well as the erosion blanket to keep those seeds on the soil and prevent them from eroding down into the water. And then on the right hand, we used a cover crop to come up to prevent weed seeds from taking advantage of the bare ground. And this site, oh, you can advance, Tracy. So as you can see, year 1 on the left, there's a lot of black-eyed Susan. That's a very short-lived but super rambunctious species. It usually is the first thing to bloom in our seeded restorations. And then on the second year, you can see that there is less black-eyed Susan blooms, but there is some swamp milkweed and bergamot peeping up. And we are excited to see the progression of this site. It is very intense on this slope. It's a lot of labor of love, and we like to use a lot of integrity and passion in these specific projects. So for the maintenance techniques for this site, we hand pulled on the less steep areas, but on more steep areas, you can see in the left hand, we're using a weed whip to knock back plants that are currently flowering to prevent the weeds that are currently flowering, and as well as herbicide applications on those more noxious weeds, such as bull thistle and reed canary grass. And our last example is a private pond homeowners association. As you can see, another turf to lakeshore with erosion issues. And lots of geese loved to take residence on this pond. So what's a word? To counteract that, we used temporary fencing, and 3 and 4-inch potted plants. So here's the process of installation, doing another herbicide application on that turf, as well as putting up fencing to deter the geese. And then here we are planting some emergents and potted plants. With these emergents, we make sure to get them into the soil very well. We even usually, it's not just hand putting them into the ground, it's making sure that they have very good soil contact if they're in the water like that. So it's usually pushing them down with our feet or things of that nature. And as you can see, this project really took off. In year 2, it just absolutely looks like Candyland to me. It is amazing the amount of blooms that we have in this project. So for this one, we did more hand pulling and cutting back those more aggressive natives. Rice cutgrass, you will become familiar with that one if it is on your sites, as it has very sharp edges and does cut. And again, we use herbicide applications to target those more noxious weeds. And here we are with more resources to take a look at. I added this Wisconsin Wetlands Association resource. They have great guides for homeowners on shoreline restoration, then as well as Minnesota wildflowers, which is great for identification, as well as iNaturalist. And then obviously the Department of Natural Resources has great information regarding shoreline restoration and plants, and Xerces Society for those pollinators. So yeah, after all of this, we hope you're very excited to start restoring any shoreline that you can. Please feel free to come visit us next spring. We have great greenhouse staff who are very educated and would love to tell you what would work on your site if you can describe the conditions to them. And we have a large selection, very large selection.
Great, thanks. I think we're good there. And if anyone has any questions, we'll just put some of our contact info up too. And yeah, I think there was some in the chat.
Yes, thank you, Tracy, Martina. That was excellent. We got tons of questions, so fasten your seatbelt.
Okay.
Mainly from many folks that sounds like they have shorelines. Deb was asking, when Martina, you were talking about plant heights front to back. She was asking, what is the front, the lakeshore or the inland or shoreward side?
That is a good question.
Yeah.
Yes, by that I meant if you're looking towards the shoreline, the front would be the part closest to you. So the taller stuff would be right on that shoreline, if that makes sense.
Yep.
Yeah, so the upland side is usually the shorter section, just where you're standing, so you can see the stuff closest to the border. But it is nice to definitely have stuff that you can see from the shoreline too, if you're in your boat or something. But usually people have a lot of great benches or patio furniture on their lawn, which is on the upland side.
And most of your plantings didn't, as you mentioned, didn't have super tall plants that would block views, and you're cutting stuff back sometimes to keep it shorter.
Yeah. There are quite a few tall plants that we do really enjoy as well, and sometimes it's nice to have definitely tall plants in there too, where maybe off to the sides, either the left or the right, and then kind of keep a more focal point to see the lake through the middle. But yeah, a lot of different heights just to kind of make a wave of different heights throughout the restoration is really great.
And then Jan was asking about Phragmites. She said, we are noticing Phragmites spreading into the marsh behind our home. And Jan has done a large restoration on her property. So it sounds like she's concerned about the incoming Phragmites and what to do.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot more Phragmites as well in our wetlands. There is a native Phragmites, and that one gets very tall as well. But we're seeing a lot more of the invasive one as well. So the first step is to definitely identify if it's the native or non-native one. And the invasive one keeps the seed head on it throughout the winter. So that really kind of helps identify it.
And the natives, sorry to cut in, the native
yeah.
species also has red where the leaf is attached to the stem. It's more reddish, so that's a key characteristic to look for as well.
Yeah, and definitely keeping it from going to seed. So once you've identified it correctly, take the seed heads off, dispose of them. And then for Phragmites, it's a very challenging species. It has to have very specific timing for the herbicide to correctly and effectively control it. We usually use herbicide to control that one. And because it's so tall, sometimes it can grow right through the herbicide and not be too affected by it. But timing, and especially in these drought years too, herbicide has been a little bit less effective as plants don't really want to uptake it as much. But I think we do a couple herbicide treatments late summer, and that usually helps quite a bit.
Great. So Deb was asking, in one of your photos, you had the barrier, a floating barrier sort of out from the planting. And she was wondering if that was to help stop or, buffer wave action to allow the plants to get established.
Yes, that is what it's mostly for, wave action, for those little floating barriers. And it doesn't necessarily have to be those plastic ones. We could put brush bundles out a few feet in front of the restoration, and those get hit by the waves first and really disperse that wave action. So there's a couple different things you can do to help mitigate that wave that's coming in from all the big boats.
And then how long would you leave that floating barrier, Tracy?
We usually just have it up about one season. We usually take it out before winter hits.
Okay.
The brush bundles stay in for several seasons. So we kind of like that way a little bit because we don't have to take them out. They stay until they degrade naturally. But that floating one we usually take out before winter hits.
Okay. Joe was asking your different strategies to remove exotics, but I think you covered that. He said besides hand pulling, or aside from hand pulling, but you talked about spot spraying, weed whacking, weed whipping. Any other strategies for once you have a planting established, how to sort the good from the bad?
Yeah, I would say weed whipping is definitely a great way to go to knock things back. Even if you can shorten a lot of weed species and let the natives jump up, then they sometimes shade out some of those invasive annuals or other non-native plants. So definitely having a really good weed whip is really nice. And yeah, encouraging biological controls like the weevils. I think there's a leafy spurge weevil we didn't mention that's really nice to have too. So I've heard of some people going out and finding those and kind of bringing a couple back to their restoration to start a little colony in their restoration. There's prescribed fire for woodies and to encourage a lot of grasses. So Yeah, but hand pulling, it is definitely a labor of love. Like Martina said, sometimes when it's 95 degrees and super humid, it's not the most fun activity in the summer, but that really can be nice. It's not super, we wouldn't recommend it on those really steep slopes like Martina mentioned. So in that case, kind of weed whipping and trying to not to disturb the soil too much is the way to go.
And if you get really good at identification, especially in the spring when the smaller or the weeds are smaller, it's a lot easier to pull them then rather than later in the season. But there are warm season weeds which will pop up later in the season. So it's just really important to know the identification at all stages.
Great. Well, we've got 3 sort of related questions about specific management of invasives. So the first one is a large dense stand of reed canary. What how do you remove that before starting the shoreline restoration? The second plant is orange ditch lilies. So the orange sounds like the orange tiger lily, daylily. And then the third plant is yellow flag iris. It sounds like a floating mat of it landed on someone's shoreline and the neighbor loves it, but what to do?
Yeah, it's too bad when some of those invasive species are kind of pretty and the neighbor really likes them. And some of those big older stands of yellow iris can be really big and really heavy. So it's nice if you can tie something around it and maybe drag it out with, tie it to a hitch and drag it out without using chemicals. That can be really nice. We sometimes do that with cattail too, just kind of drag a big clump out of the water. But there are some chemicals like Habitat that are really effective at killing iris and cattail. And then the ditch lilies we have found that they're less effective at being controlled by herbicides. So we don't use a lot of herbicides on that one, and that one we just dig up with some good old muscle. But that one can be kind of difficult where you have to get all the tubers out. If anything gets left behind, it'll resprout from those little tubers. So we dig it out and then maybe wait a few weeks, see what comes up, and then dig them out again. And then reed canary grass we've found is the most effective to spray herbicide on that. We don't love to use herbicide very much, but it's a great tool to get in, create a blank slate, and not have to come in over and over and disturb the soil. If it's starting to erode already, you can come in 1 or 2 times, spray it, kill it, and then kind of start with a blank slate there.
And just to clarify, we do use water-safe herbicides that are registered for use around water, and we are also licensed herbicide applicators, and we don't really like to see homeowners using the herbicides if they're not properly trained, in PPE, and making sure that they're not spraying on a day which could really affect the environment, as like a windy day, or just keeping in mind temperatures as well. But yeah, it's a lot to consider if you're going to decide to use herbicide. You want to use it very cautiously.
Thanks, Martina. Great minds think alike. I was going to say, can you talk about water safe herbicides? So, all right. The North Arm Bay project, Tara is asking, it looks like you kept the riprap in that project with that steep slope. And can you tell us why, or what, considerations and what the homeowner wanted and so on?
Yeah, for sure. A lot of times they might have already had the riprap there, and we don't install any riprap. That's never a part of our installation process. Sometimes it's already there, and most of the time that riprap is right along the very edge of the shoreline. And I think in that example, we were restoring more of the top hill. But yeah, a lot of times we can install emergents like blue flag iris and burr reed and soft stem bulrushes right into the riprap as well. And those plants will have their root systems go right through all the different rocks and kind of take off. So even if there is some riprap on your shoreline, you can plant into that, and some of our native plants will establish into that. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. But in a lot of different cases, people are trying to, they might have had the riprap and don't really like the aesthetics of it. So we're coming in and adding native plants to more of the upland side of it. But then we always try to get some emergence to establish as well along that riprap edge.
Yeah, Deb was asking about, she's got 12-inch riprap rocks along a 125-foot stretch of shoreline. How would you get rid of the riprap, or just as you said, Tracy, work around it since it's there?
Yeah, and that riprap, it's kind of in some ways a very temporary fix, where after a couple of years, a lot of that riprap has been pulled into the lake by ice heave and wave action. So a lot of people, especially with those 12-inch and smaller diameter rocks, have to go in and put kind of them back onto the shoreline where they've been pulled back into. So if some have already been pulled into the shoreline, you can maybe leave them in there and still try to plant into it. But otherwise, as far as removing them, sometimes we just have to come in with a big trailer and move them by hand. And it's a pretty big job, but then after that, we might reinstall some erosion control fabric, those biologs, and then plant the shoreline. Sometimes in those cases, we have to add a lot of soil behind the biologs, because once you remove all the riprap, there's not much there to plant in. So we'll add a lot of soil. But in many cases, you can plant into the riprap or add soil on top of the riprap and plant into that, and then add some erosion control fabric to kind of keep the plants in place until they spread out and kind of find their root system. So there's some options there.
Great. Karen is asking, can you talk about grants available for homeowners living on Lake Mitchell? I don't know where Lake Mitchell is, so hopefully you guys do. And if you don't, I'll have Karen specify.
I think it's in Eden Prairie.
Okay, great.
Right up, I think, Timberlake Drive. We have a couple different sites on Mitchell Lake.
Okay.
And the watershed has been really great at, I think it's Purgatory Creek Watershed District, who they've come in and sponsored a few of us to come out and actually show people how to weed and identify plants at, I think there's a commons area where we've done a restoration, where we've done a couple of classes there. But yeah, the watershed districts usually have a lot of funding. It goes really fast. So it'd be great to put in applications early. I think by now they're already finding and distributing money for next season. So it's good to get on their list very quickly. Cities and counties often have cost share programs. There's the Lawns to Lagoons program that even includes shoreline restorations. So yeah, a lot of different funding is available. And if you don't get in this year, then you can, try again for early next year. A lot of these watersheds are getting more and more people on their list every year. So then they're allocating more cost share money each year. So that's been really nice.
Great. Could you have time for a couple more questions? You
Yeah,
guys?
for sure.
All right. Okay. So there's a few about herbicide, but I think you addressed that with the water safe and making sure you hire a licensed applicator and so on. And let's see, sorry, I missed my spot here.
That's good.
Oh, question about do you have an app that you would recommend to help identify shoreline plants? So someone maybe who's starting and trying to sort out what they have existing and so on.
Yeah, we do use iNaturalist quite a bit. I think iSeek is like the sister app to that. That one is pretty accurate, where we can take a lot of different pictures, and even of ones we know what they are, we're kind of testing the app to see if that it'll throw up the right thing. And it's really nice that there's a lot of people nearby that you can kind of search by the species too and see what other people have on their restorations nearby. And again, MinnesotaWildflowers.info is a really great resource as well, because they have pictures of plants at many different stages of its life too, when it's, you know, a sapling really young to after it's flowering. So and you can always send us pictures too at our emails. A lot of times people text us pictures or email us pictures as well, and we can try to help out with identifying plants.
Great.
It's one of my favorite hobbies, so
Yeah.
email away.
Yeah,
Awesome. Love the mysteries, right?
yeah,
Yes.
it's a fun little game too.
Deb mentions in Larry Wiener's book, he recommends cutting undesirable plants off at the ground with pruners or scissors and to limit soil disturbance. Do you have an opinion on that strategy, cutting versus pulling?
Yeah, it's very similar to using a weed whip. A lot of times we'll use a weed whip just because it's faster than hand pruning every individual like goldenrod in a stand. So if you definitely have the time, it's nice to use the pruners because it's more accurate. But you'll be surprised at how good you get at weed whipping as well, and hitting the bad stuff versus the good stuff. And even if you do hit a few of the good things, you're not killing anything with a weed whip, you're just kind of setting it back. So but yeah, it's very similar to weed whipping. We definitely recommend that more on those steep slopes versus hand pulling, because that will disrupt the soil, also bring a lot of weed seeds to the surface and have those germinate as well. A lot of people pull out buckthorn and kind of create a big disturbance when they do a lot of hand pulling of buckthorn and other shrubs. And one of our strategies is to cut and treat that stump versus pulling it out, especially on really steep slopes, so we're not causing more erosion issues.
Great. Yeah, I think someone just asked about that, but you addressed the soil erosion and soil seed bank that you may be surfacing, which could be more problems than what you want.
Correct.
So last question is, Alicia's asking thoughts on dredging and its effects. Suggestions for what to recommend to someone considering dredging in conjunction with a small pond and shoreline restoration project.
Yeah, we don't actually do any dredging. It depends on the stormwater pond too. Sometimes the city has control over that, and the city will come in every, I think, 20 to 30 years to dredge out a stormwater pond. So it might be good to contact your city if it's part of their property. It can be very disruptive and throw up a lot of sediment. Sometimes alum treatments are pretty good at binding to the floating particles in a pond and having it sink to the bottom, so that helps clarity a little bit. But it's kind of, I'd be wondering why they want to dredge it out, and just to like make it deeper, or to remove invasive species or pollutants. a lot of times some of that stuff can be mitigated with a buffer, a restoration. So it's kind of on the same vein, but a little bit different when people talk about dredging. It's nice in some ways to remove large stands of cattail. If cattail are filled in a pond, then a city or us as a contractor will come in and dredge out a pond of cattail. And that can really help with a restoration, but there are a lot of local government rules when it comes to dredging too. So I would check with the city or local government.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if you just attack on that question about permitting and
Yeah.
whether it's DNR and public waters versus what you just described, like a isolated stormwater pond. Can you just let people know that there's different permitting requirements, potentially depending on the water body?
Right. Yeah. If it's a private pond on your own property that's not connected to any kind of stormwater drain, I think it's different. But that's a lot less uncommon than the pond you have attached to maybe an HOA or your local pond in your neighborhood that is definitely needs permitting and stuff like that. So.
Okay. We got a lot of great comments, great presentation. Tracy from Edina said she's worked with you and Natural Shore for years and has learned so much and is grateful for all that you've taught her. So people really enjoyed this presentation, and it's wonderful to have this subject about planting next to water bodies, because we haven't had that yet here in our chapter, and I think we'll definitely have to have you come back, talk about some more projects that you're working on. So thank you so much, Tracy and Martina.
Yeah, and thank you all for having us and being so enthusiastic about native plants and enthusiastic about learning about shorelines. We really appreciate having us.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much.
All right. Well, that wraps up our meeting tonight. Hope everyone has a relaxing Thanksgiving and holiday season. We'll have our information up soon on the website about our January program, which will be our next meeting. We don't hold a meeting in December just because people are busy with the holidays. So stay tuned. Our January program will be a speaker from out east, and we'll have more information soon on that. So, all right. Thanks again, Tracy, Martina, and have a good evening, everyone. And we'll see you
so
next New
much.
Year.
It was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.